Should you use a microinverter for your system like this Hoymiles microinverter we'll be testing today? Or should you be using a DC charge controller like this Victron unit? Or maybe you should consider a hybrid string inverter like this EG4 12K PV. Today's data might help you with some of those decisions. I've been running some experiments on microinverters from Hoymiles. And this is why the NEP microinverters that I put on my shed over a year ago have started to fail. Welcome back to Projects with Everyday Dave. It's a charts and graphs day. Let's do some experiments. To be fair, I had an unbalanced load on the inverters that failed. I had a little higher performance panel on one input than I had on the other, but I don't think that should be enough to cause a problem. I mean, what if one of the panels was shaded or producing less power consistently? They shouldn't fail for that reason. The question is what to replace them with. Enphase has a very reliable system. They are proven in the market. There's lots of data on them, but they're very expensive. You have to buy one unit per panel. That would be more than I would want to spend. So I've always been looking for alternative solutions that are also reliable. Now, fortunately, I've made friends with a local installer, Ed from Off Grid Power Systems, and he has very high confidence in these Hoymiles microinverters. Now, you can get them in single input, double input, or quadruple input. In this case, I wanted to go with quadruple input. Ed has a lot of experience with installing systems, and he's very confident that these will last a long time. So confident, in fact, that he gave me these two units so I could run the testing on them and prove it out. That way, I can give a completely unbiased viewpoint of their performance since I have no connection to the supplier whatsoever. So thank you to Ed at Off Grid Power Systems for sponsoring this install. If you live in Ohio or a nearby area and you're looking for someone to do a quality off-grid installation, check out Off Grid Power Systems. You can find a link in the description below. Now, I've been using these for several months now on a test fixture, and they've been working flawlessly. I've had no issues. The only problems that I have are with the software side. The data collection is not my favorite. You can't get the kind of granular data that I like to get. Now, for most users, that's probably not an issue. I mean, it gives you the standard information that any normal homeowner would want, but I want to download stuff to Excel down to the minute, and I can't get that data. However, I use Emporia View for monitoring my grid, and so I've been able to get granular level data using those sensors. For the experiment we're doing today, I split my wood rack array into two sections. I have 8 460 watt SunGold Power bifacial panels on this array, and I did a previous video on the performance of these panels compared to standard panels if you want to watch it. Past Dave was thinking ahead and ran 2 separate sets of conductors to this array. I'm going to run an extra set of lines here. Looking out for future Dave, he's probably going to need more power at some point. So now I can easily split it into 2 separate systems. The first 4 panels connected in series produce about 131 volts and run through the Victron Solar Charge Controller and monitored through the entire Victron system. The last 4 panels are connected, each panel individually to one of the 4 inputs on the Hoymiles microinverter. And since that produces AC, I have an AC coupled to my system and monitored with this Victron monitor. It also shows up in the Victron system, so I can compare everything using the same monitoring equipment. We're going to look at 3 sets of data: a sunny day, a snowy day, and a cloudy day. And then we'll draw some conclusions. Here we have a beautiful data set from a nice sunny day with no clouds, a true rarity in Ohio. The blue curve is the DC power from the 4-panel series string, and the orange data is the AC power from the 4 panels connected to one microinverter. At first glance, it almost looks identical, which completely surprised me. And in fact, I've been checking the production periodically on the readout, and sometimes the microinverter is outperforming the DC string. And actually, I'll link to this in the display. You can watch this anytime and see how they're performing any time of the day. The microinverter should be running at a deficit since it's converting from DC to AC, and the DC charge controller doesn't have to do that. Looking at the whole day's production, it's almost identical, with just a slight disadvantage for the DC production. However, there's some other factors we need to consider. At first, I didn't think it would be a big factor, but after running the numbers, it turns out to be quite significant. And that is the line losses from the array to the house, which is 110 feet away. Now, if the strings were identical, the losses would be the same and they would cancel out, but they're not identical. The microinverter is transmitting its power at 250 volts, and the DC string is transmitting its power at 132 volts. Now, if I had more panels put together, I could boost it up, but I'm trying to use the same number of panels for both. Voltage is very important when transmitting power. The higher the voltage, The lower the losses because the power can be transmitted at a lower current. A quick calculation at a typical midday power level for these panels shows the DC string losing 28.7 watts, while the AC string loses only 8.03 watts. So now I have to nominalize that to get a true comparison of the AC power delivered versus the DC power delivered. Since the losses vary depending on the current throughout the day, I made a new graph, removing the line loss to show the power delivered at the array for both systems. Now you can see the distinct advantage with the DC string since it doesn't have to account for the loss converting to AC. The DC charge controller allows me to charge my batteries, which are also DC, without any additional losses, converting to AC and then back to DC. However, there is yet another anomaly here. If you look closely at the data, you can see the DC string has an advantage in the morning and midday, but then it loses that advantage in the late afternoon for some reason. An analysis shows the microinverter has a 4% disadvantage in the morning and nearly the same 3.1% disadvantage midday. But then suddenly in the afternoon, that gap closes to a disadvantage of only 0.4%. Fortunately, I had an unusual combination of snow and sun, which dramatically amplified the abnormality. One winter day, I was walking past the array in late afternoon, and the reflection off the snow and the white shed was very noticeable, and I realized there was some asymmetry to the bifacial gain that happens mostly in the afternoon. This chart shows that sunny, snowy day with no snow on the panels. Without adjusting for line losses, you can see the DC string has an advantage in the morning, and the AC microinverter actually has an advantage in the afternoon. In this chart, I've adjusted for those line losses and calculated the percent loss for the AC system. The result is a 5.1% disadvantage in the morning, a 3.7% disadvantage midday, and only 2.1% in the afternoon. One thing we can learn from this is bifacial panels take advantage of every reflecting surface around them. So that's pretty neat. Fortunately, we can mitigate the effects of the reflection by looking at a cloudy day. First, I want to look at one more chart with this data. I was beginning to think that Past Dave had made a mistake. Now, he did help us by running 2 separate strings when only one was needed at the time, but he went the cheap route to save some money and put 12-gauge wire to the building instead of 10-gauge. I wondered if 10-gauge wire would have been an advantage here, so I calculated what the losses would have been for 12-gauge versus 10-gauge. And it's easy to see from this data that the higher current, lower voltage DC string does see some benefit from the 10-gauge wire, but the higher voltage AC string sees almost no benefit. And even with the 10-gauge wire, it doesn't close the gap very well between the high voltage string and the low voltage string. So I guess Past Dave's off the hook here. 10-gauge wouldn't have solved this problem. This is another great illustration of why voltage is so important. You cannot overcome it with just a larger gauge wire. Well, I suppose you could, but the cost gets very prohibitive. High voltage is your friend when it comes to transmitting power. It's not your friend when it comes to getting shocked, but just don't let that happen. Remember to turn the breaker off. All right, looking at the cloudy day with no line loss adjustment, you can see that they are almost line on line. There's a strange deviation at the end of the day, but I think that's a result of the sensors struggling to match the AC output, which fluctuates towards the end of the day as the microinverters are turning on and off in the very low light condition. That is one advantage to stringing multiple panels together. You get that voltage boosted up a little bit in really low light situations and helps stabilize the input. Looking at the raw production numbers, the output for the day for both systems is almost the same. If I adjust the plot to account for the difference in line losses, you can barely see a slight advantage for the DC string. Since on a cloudy day, we're also transmitting much less power, therefore a lot less current, then the voltage difference between the strings is less of a factor. In this case, the morning showed an overall smaller disadvantage for the microinverter at -2% in the morning, -2.1% midday, and ignoring the strange bounce at the end, -1.1% for the afternoon. This data seems to indicate a bit of an advantage for the microinverter on cloudy days, with a significantly smaller gap to the DC string than on sunny days. The Hoymiles microinverter claims a CEC peak efficiency of 96.5%, which would put it at about a 3.5% disadvantage to the straight DC string, right in line with the gap that we saw in today's data. I'm really impressed with the Hoymiles inverters. They've exceeded my expectations, and I've had them running for over a year now, so let's hope they just keep going on and on. Now let's see what conclusions we can draw from this data. First, there's a lot of ways to build a solar system, and it's highly dependent on your individual need. Microinverters have come a long way to provide some distinct advantages in certain situations. Here are some pros and cons compared to some typical options. From a cost standpoint, there are so many variables and options, I just tried to give some general guidance. In most cases, the simple DC charge controllers and AC string inverters are going to be the cheapest, followed by microinverters, and then these hybrid inverters are the most expensive, but also the most capable. If you're building your array on the roof, then you have a short distance to run, and you have the advantage of module level shutdown built right into the microinverter, which saves cost and complexity. A grid tie string inverter or a hybrid inverter will work with a roof install, but you typically need to add PV shutdown modules on the roof, which is an added expense. The DC charge controller is typically used in an off-grid situation, so that's not likely to be applicable. If you're installing a ground array, you'll be limited in how far from your building you can go, since the voltage will be limited to 250 volts. The string-style inverters and charge controllers can typically handle 400 to 600 volts, dramatically reducing the line losses, like what we saw today. If you're operating your system as a grid tie system, they all work just fine except for the DC charge controller, since it's designed to just charge battery. Most inverters these days have great efficiency, but there's likely to be some advantage for microinverters because they are able to take full advantage of each panel's individual characteristics. If it's slightly shaded, or the spec is a little different, or it just underperforms, the microinverter is going to get the most out of each panel individually. If you're building an off-grid system, microinverters and grid tie string inverters are not the best solution, but they can still be used when AC coupled with an off-grid system like the one I illustrated today. There are times when adding microinverters to an off-grid system makes sense. With the microinverter I used in this build, you could take 4 panels you got on a discount and connect them to a microinverter and backfeed the AC side of your grid tie system. The panels don't have to match the rest of your system in any way, and the power is already AC, which reduces the load on your off-grid inverter during the day. When it comes to charging batteries, microinverters and grid tie string inverters need a separate battery charger, so they're not ideal systems when you want to have a battery backup. The hybrid systems and the DC charge controllers are designed for battery charging. From a future flexibility perspective, microinverters have a distinct advantage, since each inverter is completely independent and you can easily expand with different panels in different directions without any concern for panel compatibility. The other types of systems are limited by the number of independent MPPT trackers there are, and that typically ranges from 1 to usually no more than 4. Off-Grid Power Systems, the local small business that supported this analysis, has set up an exclusive discount of $50 off a purchase of $500 or more for my viewers. They have the Hoymiles microinverters available on their website if you're interested in purchasing one of them for your system. They also have a wide assortment of batteries and everything you can imagine for Victron systems. I'll leave a link and the discount code in the description below. I replaced all the inverters on my shed with 2 Hoymiles inverters, and I'll be bringing that install video in the future. If you want a hybrid system that can operate on or off-grid with battery backup, the EG4 12K PV has been working great for me. I'll link to the install and the testing that I did for this one in the description below and at the end of this video. Signature Solar also has a discount, which is an automatic $50 off a purchase of $500 or more for my viewers using the link in the description below or on my website, projectswithdave.com, where you can find a lot of other resources and discounts for your projects. Want to learn more? Watch one of these 2 videos like this one on my EG4 12K PV install. I finally hit 100,000 subscribers, and that's pretty neat. I never had a goal of creating a YouTube channel. I just posted my experience installing my own solar system a few years ago, and here we are. So thank you for your support through corrections, ideas, and all the encouragement that you give me in the comments. It's been a lot of fun, and I'll see you next time.